The wind howled through the twisted branches of the ironwood forest, carrying the scent of dry earth and the metallic tang of approaching danger. Pippin stood trembling on legs that looked like snapped twigs, his large, liquid eyes reflecting the gloom of the gathering storm above. He was the smallest fawn born that spring, a creature of fragility in a world that demanded iron and bone from its inhabitants to survive. His mother, a gentle doe named Mara, nudged him closer to the center of the thicket, her warm tongue rasping over his velvet ears in a silent gesture of reassurance. The herd was restless, 50 nervous hearts beating in a frantic rhythm that seemed to vibrate through the cracked soil beneath their hooves. A drought had ravaged their sanctuary, turning the lush green sanctuary into a withered skeleton of its former self. Silas, the massive alpha stag with antlers that scraped the sky like jagged lightning, paced at the perimeter of the clearing, his breath misting in the chilling air. He knew, as they all did, that staying here meant a slow death by thirst, that leaving meant crossing the Shadow Gorge. The gorge was a nightmare etched into the geography of the forest, a place where the sun dared not touch the ground, and predators lurked in eternal twilight. Pippin watched Silas with a mixture of awe and inadequacy, feeling the weight of his own smallness against the backdrop of the stag's immense power. The other fawns, stronger and faster, had already begun to mock Pippin's stumbling gait, leaving him trailing behind during their practice runs. They called him the Wisp, a thing so light and insignificant that a stiff breeze might carry him away forever. "We move at dusk," Silas's voice rumbled through the clearing, low and commanding, instantly silencing the anxious murmurs of the herd. The command sent a fresh wave of adrenaline through Pippin, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate for the sky. He looked at his legs, willing them to be stronger, praying to the forest spirits that he would not be the anchor that dragged his mother down. As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in bruises of purple and blood orange, the herd began their silent exodus toward the mouth of the gorge. The air grew heavy and still, the usual chorus of crickets and night birds absent, replaced by a suffocating silence that pressed against their ears. Every snap of a twig sounded like a gunshot, causing heads to snap up and ears to swivel frantically, searching for the source of the noise. The entrance to the Shadow Gorge loomed before them like the open throat of a subterranean beast, jagged rocks acting as teeth against the gray sky. Shadows stretched unnaturally long here, twisting and contorting as if they were alive and watching the trembling herd with hungry intent. Pippin felt a cold shiver trace the line of his spine, a primal warning that screamed at him to run back to the dying light of the safety they were leaving. They entered single file, the rocky path narrowing until the stone walls brushed against their flanks, cold and damp with the moisture of the deep earth. The smell here was ancient and rot-heavy, the scent of things that had died in the dark and never been found. Pippin stayed glued to Mara's flank, matching her step for step, his eyes wide and straining to pierce the unnatural gloom. Hours bled into an eternity of tension, the only sound the clatter of hooves on stone and the ragged breathing of the terrified animals. Suddenly, Silas stopped dead in his tracks, his head lowered, his majestic antlers sweeping the air as he scented the breeze. A low growl, vibrating through the rock floor rather than the air, froze the blood in Pippin's veins. From the darkness above, eyes appeared yellow, glowing, and filled with a malice that transcended mere hunger, burning like cold fire in the void. The wolves of the gorge had been waiting, their patience born of cruel experience, knowing the drought would eventually force the deer into this fatal bottleneck. It wasn't just one wolf. The darkness seemed to peel back to reveal a dozen, their gray fur blending perfectly with the stone. Panic is a contagion, and it swept through the herd faster than wildfire, dissolving their order into a chaotic, swirling mass of bleeding terror. The wolves descended like falling boulders, silent and deadly, their impact breaking the line and separating mothers from fawns. Silas roared a sound of defiance and charged the largest wolf, his antlers clashing with snapping jaws in a brutal dance of survival. Pippin was knocked sideways by a fleeing buck, tumbling hard against the rough stone wall, the breath driven from his small lungs in a painful wheeze. He scrambled to his hooves, dazed, his vision swimming, only to see Mara cornered by two gaunt wolves, their teeth bared in anticipation. She kicked out, her hooves flashing, but she was tired, and the predators were fresh, circling her with practiced, lethal coordination. Fear, absolute and paralyzing, gripped Pippin, urging him to squeeze into a crevice and hide until the slaughter was over. But then he saw the resignation in his mother's eyes, the way she dipped her head, accepting that she would die to buy the herd a moment. That look shattered the paralysis, replacing the cold ice of fear with the white-hot heat that started in his belly and flooded his limbs. He didn't think about his size or his weakness. He only thought about the noise he could make and the speed he could summon from his terror. With a bleat that sounded more like a battle cry, Pippin launched himself not away from the danger, but directly across the wolves' path. It was a suicidal distraction, a flash of brown fur that broke the wolves' concentration just long enough for the line to break. "Run, mother!" He screamed in the language of the wild, his hooves skittering on the shale as he turned and bolted deeper into the gorge, away from the herd. The wolves, driven by the instinct to chase the fleeing prey, turned their attention from the formidable doe to the easy snack that was running away. 3 of them peeled off, their claws scrabbling for purchase as they launched themselves after the small fawn. Pippin ran with a speed he didn't know he possessed, his legs blurring, his lungs burning as if he were inhaling fire. The terrain was a nightmare of loose rocks and sharp drop-offs, but his small size allowed him to navigate paths the wolves found difficult. He could hear their panting, feel the heat of their breath on his heels, the snapping of jaws inches from his tail. He wasn't running aimlessly. He remembered the stories Silas had told of the gorge, of the treacherous blind man's drop, where the path ended in nothingness. It was a gamble, a desperate roll of the dice against death, but it was the only card he had left to play. He scrambled up a narrow incline, his hooves slipping, sending showers of pebbles raining down into the faces of his pursuers. The lead wolf, a scarred beast with one ear, lunged, his teeth grazing Pippin's flank, drawing a thin line of blood that stung like a whip. Pippin yelped but didn't slow, using the pain as fuel, pushing his muscles beyond the point of exhaustion. He could see the edge now, a sharp lip of rock where the ground simply vanished into the black abyss below. He didn't slow down. Instead, he accelerated, driving his legs into the stone with every ounce of strength his fragile body contained. The wolves, seeing the edge too late, tried to skid to a halt, their claws creating sparks against the granite. Pippin reached the precipice and, with a mighty leap, launched himself into the void, aiming for a narrow ledge on the other side. For a heartbeat, he was flying, suspended in the dark air, a creature of the sky rather than the earth. He landed hard on the opposite ledge, his legs buckling, his chin slamming against the stone, but he was alive. Behind him, the momentum of the chase carried the lead wolf over the edge, his howl of surprise swallowed instantly by the dark. The other 2 wolves skidded to a halt at the very brink, teetering dangerously before clawing their way back, barking in frustration at the gap that separated them. Pippin lay panting on the narrow ledge, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might bruise his ribs, staring back at the predators. They snarled, pacing the edge, but the gap was too wide for their heavier bodies to clear without a running start they didn't have. He lay there for a long time, listening to the sounds of the hunt fading in the distance, the screams of the herd replaced by an eerie silence. Had he saved them? Or had his sacrifice been in vain, a small spark extinguished in a vast and uncaring darkness? Slowly, painfully, Pippin rose to his shaking legs, his body bruised and bleeding, but his spirit strangely unbroken. He navigated the narrow ledge, which wound its way up the canyon wall, eventually leading him to the upper rim of the gorge. The moonlight greeted him there, cool and silver, illuminating the vast expanse of the whispering plains that lay beyond the danger. And there, gathered by the edge of the tree line, was the herd, huddled together, licking their wounds and counting their losses. Mara stood at the edge, her head lowered, her posture one of profound mourning, believing her son to be lost to the dark. When Pippin stepped into the clearing, a hush fell over the group, absolute and heavy with disbelief. He went forward, his head held high, no longer the wisp, but a survivor forged in the fires of the Shadow Gorge. Mara's cry was a sound of pure heartbreak turned to joy, and she bounded forward to cover his face with frantic licks. Silas approached slowly, his own flank bleeding from a deep gash, his eyes locking onto the small fawn. He didn't speak, but he lowered his massive head, touching his nose to Pippin's shoulder, a gesture of respect usually reserved for elders. The other fawns, the ones who had mocked him, stood back, their eyes wide with a new understanding of what strength truly meant. They realized that courage was not measured in the width of one's chest or the sharpness of one's antlers. It was measured in the willingness to stand when every instinct screamed to run, to protect others when you could barely protect yourself. The herd moved on, finding the fresh springs and green grass of the plains, but the dynamic had shifted irrevocably. Pippin healed, though he carried the scars of the wolf's teeth on his flank for the rest of his life. He never grew to be the largest stag nor the fastest, but when he spoke, the herd listened with an intensity they gave to no other. Seasons turned, the leaves falling and growing again, and the story of the brave little deer became a legend whispered in the ironwood. Young fawns who felt too small or too weak would look at Pippin and see not a runt, but a warrior. They learned that fear is not an enemy to be destroyed, but a signal to be mastered, a challenge to rise above. One evening, years later, a terrible storm threatened to wash away the riverbanks where the new generation of fawns was sleeping. The waters rose terrifying speed, the roar of the river drowning out the cries of the mothers. It was Pippin, now gray around the muzzle, who plunged first into the churning water. He didn't have the weight to anchor himself against the current, but he knew the flow of the water. Having studied it with the same intensity he had the gorge, he formed a living bridge with his body, wedging himself between two boulders, allowing the smaller fawns to use his back as a stepping stone. The water battered him, cold and relentless, threatening to crush his ribs and fill his lungs. He held on, his vision tunneling, his muscles screaming in agony, fueled by the same fire that had ignited in the gorge all those years ago. One by one, the fawns scrambled to safety, their small hooves digging into his fur until the last one was safe on dry land. Only then did Pippin let go, allowing the current to take him, washing him downstream to the shallows. When they found him, battered and exhausted on the riverbank, he was barely breathing, his chest heaving with shallow, ragged gasps. The entire herd surrounded him, creating a wall of warmth against the biting wind, keeping vigil through the long night. They understood that they were in the presence of a greatness that transcended the physical laws of the forest. Pippin survived that night, proving once again that the spirit is the strongest muscle in the body. He taught them that heroism isn't about being invincible. It's about being vulnerable and acting anyway. It is about looking into the face of the impossible and finding a way, not for glory, but for love. The moral etched into the hearts of the herd was clear. Even the smallest stone can change the course of a mighty river. Pippin's legacy was not written in the enemies he defeated, but in the lives he saved and the hope he inspired. In the end, the brave little deer showed them that the size of the shadow you cast is determined by the light burning within you. As the years passed, Pippin eventually lay down for the final time, returning to the earth that he had walked so lightly upon. But the herd never forgot him. They would often pause at the entrance of the Shadow Gorge, remembering the flash of brown fur that saved them. And whenever a young fawn felt afraid of the dark, the elders would tell the story of Pippin, and the fear would turn to resolve. The forest is a hard place, unforgiving and cruel, where the weak are culled and the strong survive to breed. But occasionally, a spirit arises that defies this natural order, proving that compassion and bravery are survival traits too. Pippin was that anomaly, a testament to the fact that the heart is the only compass that truly matters in the wilderness of life. Even the wolves, in their own way, remembered him, the generation that followed passing down a wariness of the small deer with the spirit of a lion. They learned that prey is not defined by its size, but by its will to live and its capacity to sacrifice. It changed the way the forest breathed, adding a layer of respect to the eternal dance of hunter and hunted. The flowers that grew where Pippin famously leaped across the abyss seemed to bloom brighter, their petals of vibrant defiance against the gray stone. Travelers would sometimes stop there, feeling a strange sense of peace, unaware of the drama that had unfolded on that spot. It was a holy ground of sorts, sanctified by the courage of a creature who refused to accept the limitations placed upon him. The wind still howls through the ironwood forest, and the drought still comes to test the resilience of the living. But the despair that once accompanied these trials is gone, replaced by a collective memory of triumph against the odds. Every fawn born is checked not just for the straightness of its legs, but for the brightness in its eyes. Pippin's story reminds us that we all have a shadow gorge to cross, a moment where we are cornered by the wolves of our own lives. In that moment, we have a choice: to cower in the shadows of our insecurities or to leap into the unknown. It asks us to find the roar within our own silence, to be the distraction that saves, to be the bridge that connects. The true measure of a life is not in its duration, but in its donation to the survival and spirit of others. Pippin gave everything, not because he was asked to, but because his nature would allow nothing less. And in doing so, he became more than just a deer. He became a beacon, a timeless symbol of the power that lies dormant in the humblest of us. So if you ever find yourself standing before a chasm, trembling as the darkness closes in around you, remember the wisp. Remember that your legs may shake, your heart may pound, and you may feel small against the magnitude of the challenge. But if you leap with the full force of your spirit, you might just find that you can fly. The bravery of the little deer echoes in the rustle of the leaves and the murmur of the streams, a song of resilience. It is a melody that encourages us to stand tall, even when we feel small, and to fight, even when we are outnumbered. For in the grand design of the world, it is the size of the fight in the heart that determines the victor. The sun sets on the forest, casting long shadows once again, but the herd does not fear the night as they once did. They sleep soundly, guarding one another, knowing that bravery is a torch that can be passed from one heart to another. And in their dreams, they run with Pippin, forever bounding across the abyss, forever safe, forever brave.